So, is a Unitarian allowed to say Merry Christmas? I think so, but it's not without some controversy. There was a 1947 article in the Christian Century that was addressing this very question. In the back pages of the 1947 edition of the Christian Century around Christmas time, there was an editorial from the editorial board of this magazine addressing the question of who got to own Christmas. Was it a monopolized entity by Trinitarians? And they explored for a little bit whether or not Unitarians got to celebrate or not. Apparently, they had had letters sent to the magazine trying to stir up some controversy around whether or not we were allowed to do this. Even before the internet, there were trolls, apparently. And the editorial board for the Christian Century came down on the side of yes. Not only did they say that Unitarians had been practicing Christmas for a long time, whether Trinitarians liked it or not, and would likely continue to do so, but they laid claim to the fact that you don't have to agree about who Jesus was, who God is, whether God is three or one, to embrace the spirit of Christmas. And so the editorial board of this Christian magazine said, we can all disagree about who Jesus is and still practice, which I thought was really nice of them in 1947. Thank you, Christian Century. However, they're voicing something that's been true for a long time, which is almost nobody has ever agreed about who Jesus was, despite claims of a fundamentalist or your sister-in-law. Since the very beginning, at least since he was alive, nobody seems to have been able to agree on exactly who or what he was or what the meaning of his life was. If you read the early Christian writings, it states that even the disciples couldn't figure it out. He would ask them questions like, who do you say I am? And somebody said, you're the reincarnation of Elijah, which is interesting that some of them apparently believed in reincarnation. Or some of them would say, well, you're kind of like John the Baptist. Some of them thought he was a more political figure, or the anointed one, that word Christ, which means Messiah, the one who's supposed to liberate the Jewish people. Point being, even this crew of a dozen people that he put together couldn't get on the same page, even in his lifetime. Later, the people who wrote the scriptures, 60 to 85 years after his life, wrote different versions with sometimes conflicting details. They had different priorities and agendas. In fact, 2 of the 4 New Testament writers don't include the Christmas story at all. Half of the stories about the teacher Jesus have nothing to say about a manger, a virgin birth, a stable, an inn, a tyrannical ruler, or a baby child. At least 2 of them didn't think it was worth mentioning. And yet, there's an idea floating around that only one ideology gets to own this thing. Christmas hasn't looked this way always. And no matter what a blustering politician might say about bringing Merry Christmas back, or people on the news getting angry about Starbucks cups, or whatever controversy is being created out of thin air to sell airtime, anytime someone's trying to make you afraid so that you'll buy their time, make you angry, just remember, Christmas as we've known it has really only existed for about 150 years. In fact, if we want to go back to how the people who at least started the United States intended it, if we want to really honor their wishes, we should make Christmas illegal, because it was. In the Puritan era here in the United States, or what was then the colonies, celebrating Christmas was a crime, punishable by a fine. You see, you weren't working. and the Puritans wanted you to work. There were a few Sabbath days a year, but Christmas certainly wasn't one of them. And in fact, to me, an interesting fact in this whole thing is that the Puritans made Christmas illegal for exactly the same reasons as I didn't like Christmas when I was an angry atheist. They said it is a made-up holiday that was used to overlap an old Roman pagan holiday. Jesus' birthday wasn't December 25th, and so we shouldn't celebrate it. Christmas got wild in those days, and you would spend all days out in the woods imbibing, and the Puritans didn't like that at all. And so if you got caught, you could be publicly shamed or fined. It really wasn't even until the mid-1800s that people in the United States and in the West started practicing Christmas like you and I see it. In a church, with stores closed and Christmas Eve services. This wasn't a thing. In fact, in the old days, shops stayed open and churches were closed. Again, so that you could work hard all day. We had a lot to do with why Christmas looks the way it does. Unitarians and Universalists have played a significant role in making Christmas look the way that everyone thinks it should look. In fact, the Unitarians and the Universalists were some of the first that argued that Christmas should be celebrated at all in the United States. Even when it was illegal, little bands of Universalists would celebrate Christmas on December 25th secretly to celebrate the birth of the radical teacher whose life would save all people. In fact, in the early 1800s, the Unitarians and the Universalists in Boston got together for a sort of marketing campaign. They paid for flyers and public speakers, and they tried to get Boston to celebrate Christmas. They said we should close the shops and open the churches. This is like 1804. They lost that battle, and nobody wanted to join them in celebrating Christmas. And it really wasn't celebrated at all widely until the mid-1800s, when they won the battle again. So, for my first point, the fact that you celebrate Christmas at all, we helped with that. I'd say we can own it. But let's look at some of the other favorite elements of Christmas. The Christmas tree. The Christmas tree is said to have been brought to America for the first time by the German Unitarian minister Charles Follen, who had a church in Lexington, Massachusetts. It was a German practice to have that tree with candles lit and toys or prizes on the lower branches so that young children could come and reach them and have a treat for the day. Charles Follen, the German abolitionist Unitarian, had this practice in his home, and writers who had come by to see and visit him picked up on this, and it spread. This is in the early to mid-1800s. Jingle Bells, written by the music director of the Unitarian Church in Savannah, Georgia. It Came Upon a Midnight Clear, written by the Unitarian minister Edmund Sears. Except in his version, the peace that was brought to the earth 2,000 years ago was now meant to calm the U.S. after the Mexican-American War. A Christmas Carol, written by Charles Dickens, a Unitarian. So, my friends, if you're ever sitting underneath a Christmas tree, giving gifts while you're watching a Christmas Carol on TV or a Muppet Christmas Carol, or whichever one you like better, if you see Santa Claus at the North Pole with elves, that image, now while Santa has lived at the North Pole for a long, long time with elves, not everybody knew about it until a Unitarian cartoonist named Thomas Nast in the mid-1850s began to draw Santa at the North Pole. The jolly, large man with red cheeks and elves. And that notion became more popular, and people found out that that's where he lived because of his drawings. So, when there's elves and Santa at the North Pole, when a Christmas carol's on TV and you're underneath a Christmas tree, giving presents while singing jingle bells, you can thank a Unitarian. Give yourself a little pat on the back for contributing to making Christmas what it is. A Christmas Carol. Think of that story about a man who turns his life around from stinginess to generosity. Written by Charles Dickens, who himself converted to Unitarianism in the mid-1800s after visiting Boston and visiting William Ellery Channing, who our fellowship hall is named after, and Ralph Waldo Emerson. Now, in the apocryphal version of the story, Charles Dickens, the famous writer, had said he didn't want to see anyone in his hotel room. But William Ellery Channing, being the famous minister he was, pulled up in his horse-drawn carriage and ordered Dickens to come down and talk to him. Him saying yes to the only person in Boston he would say yes to. Dickens comes down, rides through Boston in the horse-drawn carriage, and by the end is convinced he's now a Unitarian. That's the version I like. I don't know if it's true. But Dickens did write in 1842 that he came to America and was pretty disappointed with what he found. Slavery, economics of a growing divide between rich and poor. He said one thing made him leave America feeling good: Unitarianism. He said, I think I'm going to do what I've been thinking about doing for a long time, join the Unitarian Church in London, after talking to Channing and Emerson. So Charles Dickens goes back to London in 1843, joins a Unitarian church, and writes A Christmas Carol, while he's heavily involved as a volunteer there. In A Christmas Carol, this novel about Christmas, the word Jesus does not appear in the entire story. Instead, Dickens focuses on what he thought the Unitarians were good at: addressing poverty and justice, an obligation to do well to other humans. Look at that conversion that Scrooge has in the story. It's not a religious conversion where he atones for his sins to a God in heaven. Rather, Scrooge says that his sins have been to his fellow humans. His conversion is an ethical turn toward generosity and peace, compassion and justice in this life and this world, not somewhere else. Now, the next time you watch a TV show about Christmas or watch a movie about Christmas, I guarantee you the plot is a variation on one theme. There is not enough Christmas spirit, and unless somebody has a change of heart, it won't happen. Dickens' Unitarian version of a radical change of heart toward generosity and goodwill becomes the prototype of the Christmas story. So here we are, under Christmas trees, with presents, singing hymns written by our folks. The story of a change of heart right here and right now. See, one of the interesting things we got to do was take this story, which used to be about the transformation of the world 2,000 years ago, and remind everyone that it was also about the transformation of ourselves right here and right now. The Dickens story says, and the Unitarian interpretation of Christmas says, this isn't just somebody else's story. It's yours. One of the things that you probably don't get to see about our Christmas pageant is what happens at the rehearsal. Right before the wildness that is the pageant rehearsal, in the narthex, our children's ministry director, Karen Lewis, sits down with the children who are going to be in the pageant, and she reads the Christmas story to them, and then explains why we have Christmas here. Karen sits down and looks the kids in the eyes and says, we celebrate Christmas in this church because we believe that it's not just a story about somebody else. It's a story about us. That we believe that every night a child is born is a holy night. That every single human being is invited to be the vehicle through which hope is born into the world. That every single child and every single human being has the capacity to stand up to empires that break people's body or spirit. And that the everybody used in that language means you. We celebrate Christmas because you are invited. So I don't care what the Starbucks cup looks like this year, or what anybody on TV has to say. You take a story about a radical homeless Jewish rabbi born to an unwed teenage mother who goes on to preach a radical love and justice that will not exclude anyone. Nobody gets to say they own that story. Everybody is invited this Christmas. Tonight, in this room, we're going to gather again and light candles. As the night gets dark, as it grows cold, as the night is as long as it likely will be for a long time, we'll hold up a flame as evidence that we believe hope is possible no matter what. And those candles will be held by 95-year-olds and 5-year-olds. We will sing the songs that we've sung for generations because we believe with enough passion, just like that young girl thousands of years ago, you can give birth to hope today. So like Reverend Rabel said, you're invited to Christmas, but only if you bring a light. Only if you're the kind of person who is willing to share the hope that you've experienced. Only if you're the kind of person who is willing to exclude none from the circle of love and justice. Only if you're the kind of person who is willing to undergo a radical change of heart in this season that says we will be saved not in another world, but in this one, by building something loving and just right here and right now. Welcome, and Merry Christmas, and Amen.